Peace, I am Ivan. Today we will discuss in depth the third episode, Historical Examination of the Quran, the Challenge of Manuscript and Documentary Evidence. Please prepare your pillows and have a sweet dream. At the heart of our discussion is the question of whether the Quran or the Bible is the truly reliable and trustworthy sacred text. To answer this question, we must move beyond the level of personal belief and move to an objective historical analysis that can be accepted by non-believers or third parties. This includes examining manuscripts, texts, and archaeological data. The Quran claims to have been revealed between 610 and 632 AD. If these claims are true, then we should be able to find evidence to support its historical authenticity during these periods. Today, we will first take a deep look at the historical evidence for the Quran from two perspectives, manuscripts and texts. First, let's look at the manuscript evidence for the Quran. Unlike the Bible, manuscript analysis of the Quran presents unique problems. The data show that we have almost no verifiable Muslim texts or Quranic manuscripts that provide a glimpse into the formative period of Islam within about 100 years of Muhammad's death, that is, before 750 AD. In fact, our earliest surviving primary Muslim texts are generally 150 to 300 years later than the events they describe, so there is a considerable gap in time. This means that they are all usefully secondary sources, because they rely on many original materials that are no longer extant. Although Muslim tradition claims that several copies of the Quran in the Uthmanic recension were made and sent to Mecca, Medina, Basra, and Damascus shortly after Muhammad's death, we have no evidence for the existence of these original Quranic texts. Even if these copies may have disintegrated due to age, we should have some fragments to refer to. However, no verifiable Quranic manuscripts have survived before the 8th century AD. The earliest attestable Quran manuscripts, such as the Ma'il Codex in the British Library, are dated to the late 8th century, around 790 AD. This suggests that it was not compiled just 16 years after Muhammad's death, as some Muslims claim, but rather a text that emerged some 160 years later. The two older Quran manuscripts often mentioned by Muslims are the Samarkand and Topkapi manuscripts. However, philological and paleographical analysis of these manuscripts has raised serious doubts about their early dating. Both manuscripts are written in the Kufic script. According to modern Quran manuscript experts such as Martin Lings and Yassin Hamid Safadi, the Kufic script did not appear until the late 8th century, c. 790s AD and later, and was not used at all in Mecca and Medina in the 7th century. The Kufic script is named after the city of Kufa in Iraq, which was not conquered by the Arabs until 639 AD. Therefore, it is very strange that a script named after a conquered city became the official writing script of the mother of all scriptures in just a dozen years. The Kufic script was perfected around the late 8th century and was widely used after the Abbasid Caliphate took control of the Islamic world in 750 AD. This is consistent with the Persian background of the Abbasids, who were based in the Kufa and Baghdad regions and naturally wanted their regional scripts to be popular. Therefore, the Samarkand and Topkapi manuscripts, which use the Kufic script, can only be dated to the late 700s or early 800s, 100 to 150 years after the compilation of the Uthmanic script, c. 650 AD. Inscriptions on coins also provide important evidence. Late 7th century Umayyad coins, such as the first purely Islamic gold coins introduced by Caliph Abd al-Malik in 697 AD, use pre-Kufic script. This script is markedly different from later Kufic scripts, with capital letters standing upright and closely spaced. However, from 745 AD on Abbasid coins, we begin to see official Kufic scripts, characterized by long horizontal lines between letters. This is the style of writing we find in the Samarkand and Topkapi manuscripts. This again confirms that Kufic was not introduced into Islamic writing until the Abbasid period, after 750 AD. The format of the two manuscripts also points to a later date. Both are in landscape format, where the paper is wider than it is high, a format borrowed from 8th and 9th century Syrian and Iraqi Christian texts. In contrast, earlier Arabic manuscripts were in upright format. The Samarkand manuscript itself shows irregular text and messy writing, with some pages neat and others quite chaotic, and even the Arabic letter Kaf is sometimes excluded and sometimes dominant. This suggests that the manuscript may have been compiled from fragments of different manuscripts and completed by a later scribe at a later date. Artistic decorations in the manuscript, such as colored bands and emblems, also lead paleographers to infer that it is a product of the 9th century rather than the 7th century Uthman definitive. The Topkapi manuscript also contains decorative emblems, suggesting that it is later. Moreover, there are significant differences between the Samarkand and Topkapi manuscripts in the number of lines. Topkapi has 18 lines per page, Samarkand has 8 to 12 lines, and writing style, which means that they could not have been copied by the same group of scribes at the same time, and it is almost impossible that they were both original copies of Uthman. This gap is even more striking when we compare the manuscript evidence for the Quran to that for the Bible. The New Testament has over 24,000 extant manuscript copies, including 5,300 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin Vulgates, and 9,300 other early translations. Of these, as many as 230 manuscripts date to before 600 AD. Many of these manuscripts existed before the 7th century AD, before Muhammad's birth, and are very close in date to the originals, some even being written within a few decades of the originals. For example, the famous Magdalene manuscript, a fragment of Matthew 26, has been analyzed by scholar Dr. Karsten Tita to date to 50 to 68 AD, meaning it could have existed during the lifetime of the apostles and eyewitnesses, and could even have been part of the original manuscript. In contrast, the Quran did not have an authenticated manuscript until the 8th century. In addition, there are over 15,000 early translations of the Bible, such as Latin and Syriac, some dating back to 150 AD, and 2,135 lectionaries dating from the 6th century. The writings of the early Church Fathers also contain a large number of biblical quotations, as many as 86,489, of which 32,000 are from before the Council of Nicaea in 325 AD. One study pointed out that the entire New Testament can be almost completely reconstructed based on the quotations of the Church Fathers alone, with only 11 verses missing. This richness of text greatly enhances the reliability of the Bible, making it almost impossible for any forgery or tampering to hide from all translations, lectionaries, and citations of the Church Fathers. Muslims have proposed several explanations for the lack of early documents, but these have been refuted by the data. First, was there a lack of writing materials in the Arab world? Paper was invented and widely used in the 4th century AD. The Umayyad dynasty, headquartered in Syria, the former Byzantine region, was a highly civilized society, and the use of secretaries in the caliph's court proved that manuscript writing was quite advanced. In addition, caravan trade required records, which could not be based on memory alone. The Quran itself was also declared to be the greatest revelation, and such an important text must have been preserved in copies. Second, was there a prevalence of oral tradition? Although the Arabs had an oral tradition, Muslims themselves claim that there were multiple copies of the Quran shortly after Muhammad's death, such as the copies of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Abu Musa, and Ubay ibn Ka'b. If these copies are not written documents, then what are they? The Uthmanic manuscript itself must be a written text. Finally, did the documents decompose over time? New Testament manuscripts such as the Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Alexandrinus in the British Library were written in the 4th century AD, 300 or 400 years before the Quran is said to have been written, yet they are still in good condition. If the Uthman definitive was so important, why was it not written on materials that have survived to this day? Even if it had worn out from use, it would have been replaced by a copy written on a more durable material such as animal skin, as many other ancient documents were. However, we have no evidence of the existence of the original Quranic text. Even if the manuscript had disintegrated, fragments would have survived. Next, we turn to the documentary evidence for the Quran. This has been difficult due to the scarcity of early original texts. The earliest available sources for Muslims are Muslim traditions, such as Ibn Ishaq's Sirah, which were not compiled until 765 AD, while large collections of hadith, such as those of Bukhari and Muslim, were not completed until the 9th century, which is 200 to 250 years later than the facts and too late for our study. Therefore, we must go back to the 7th century itself and see what documents were available at that time to confirm the authenticity of the Quran. Two non-Muslim documents from the 7th century help: the Doctrina Iacobee and the Armenian Chronicle. The Doctrina Iacobee. This is an anti-Semitic document written in Palestine in Greek between 634 and 640 AD. It warns Jews against mixing with Saracens, i.e., Arabs, and mentions the danger of life falling into the hands of these Jews and Saracens. The Armenian Chronicle. This chronicle, written around 660 AD, was written by Bishop Sebeos. It describes Muhammad as establishing a community of Ishmaelites, Arabs, and Jews, whose common foundation was Abraham. The document even mentions that Muhammad gave both communities inheritance rights to the Holy Land. These early non-Muslim sources indicate that relations between Arabs and Jews were good in the period after the first Muslim conquest, late 620s AD, and even before 640 AD, they seem to have been allies. This contrasts with the Quran's claim that Muhammad severed ties with the Jews in 624 AD, soon after the Hijrah, and changed the Qibla from Jerusalem to Mecca, Surah 2:144, 149 to 150. Muslims insist that Mecca is the center of Islam, the center of history, the mother of cities, where Adam built the original Kaaba, later rebuilt by Abraham and Ishmael. Muhammad also grew up around Mecca and sought to return to it after his exile in Medina. However, there is almost no written reference to Mecca before the rise of Islam. Aside from a possible reference to Makaraba by the Greek-Egyptian geographer Ptolemy in the middle of the 2nd century AD, but it is uncertain whether it refers to Mecca. The first confirmed document mentioning Mecca's existence does not appear until the early 8th century, 724 to 743 AD, a full 100 years later than the time when Islamic tradition places it on the historical stage. More historically challenging is the Muslim claim that Mecca was a trading center for Arabia in the 7th century and earlier. However, scholars' research refutes this. First, the geographical location is not conducive to trade. Research by Roman Bouliet, R.W. Bouliet, points out that Mecca is hidden on the edge of the peninsula and cannot be regarded as a natural intersection of north-south and east-west trade routes. Groom and Muller also believe that the trade route would have bypassed Mecca by about 100 miles. 2. Lack of natural resources. Patricia Crone points out that Mecca was a barren place with no natural stopping points, especially not far from famous green environments such as Ta'if. Ta'if had both wells and sanctuaries and food supplies, making it a more suitable stop for caravans. 3. Types of trade goods. The main trade goods in the Arab region at that time were leather and clothing, which could not support the development of an international-scale commercial empire. 3. Changes in international trade routes. After the 1st century, trade between Greece and India had completely turned to maritime trade, conducted from the coast of the Red Sea. Maritime transportation was much cheaper than land transportation. For example, in the Roman period, it was cheaper to transport grain 1,250 miles by sea than 50 miles by land. In the time of Muhammad, there was no international trade in the Arab region. 4. Ease of control. By the 3rd century AD, Greco-Roman trade with India had collapsed. The remaining trade was controlled by Ethiopians, not Arabs, and the center of trade at the time was the Ethiopian port of Adulis on the Red Sea, not Mecca. 5. Greek texts do not mention Mecca. Early Greek trade texts mention Ta'if, Yathrib, later Medina, and Khaybar, but never Mecca. 6. Confusion of location within Islamic tradition. Even within Islamic tradition, there is confusion about the original geographical location of Mecca. There are records that during the First and Second Civil Wars, people traveled from Medina to Iraq via Mecca. However, Mecca is southwest of Medina and Iraq is northeast. This suggests that the holy place of Islam was once located north of Medina, in the opposite direction of today's Mecca. In summary, not only does the documentary evidence contradict the Quran's date for the break in relations between Arabs and Jews, but the Quran's reference to the birthplace and cornerstone of Islam, Mecca, is almost impossible to accurately identify in history until at least a century later. All of this manuscript and documentary evidence points to a disturbing conclusion. The Quran we read today may not be exactly the same text that Muslim tradition claims was compiled and finalized by Uthman in 650 AD. Instead, the evidence suggests that the Quranic text went through a process of evolution. All of this gives us ample reason to question the Quran's historical reliability. In the following shows, we will continue to delve deeper into the archaeological evidence for the Quran and compare it with the evidence from the Bible in more detail. Thank you for your support. I hope you can subscribe, turn on notifications, and share to support this channel to continue. To learn more, join my Patreon. There is a text version in the member area. Let us know God, think about faith, and live out Christ together. Goodbye.